The first-person shooter genre is one that's been popular for a number of years now, and that's no different today. You get dozens of releases a year, probably even more, and when it comes down to it, it all sort of boils down to one thing. So many games try to branch out in a way to this, or give you this type of a gun. But maybe sometimes, it's the best idea to, rather than adding mechanics, cut down mechanics and see what makes a game fun. And not many games stand out to me when talking about something like that, compared to the signature first-person series and also a, fairly recent release of Doom. Now this video is titled The Beautiful Simplicity of Doom, and that's exactly what it's going to be about. I'm gonna try to get down to the bottom of what makes Doom fun and why the developers chose to go that way. We're gonna talk about multiple aspects of the game, where they decided to cut and where they decided to add, complete with actual quotes from the developers, to hopefully see what makes a shooter fun and to realize that it's not always a ton of added mechanics. Now a quick disclaimer before we start: if you feel like you would rather be reading this than listening to me say it, there's a wonderful Gamma Sutra article called Make Me Think, Make Me Move, which will be linked down into the description, which will pretty much describe most of what I'm going to be saying in written form. So if you feel like reading that instead of listening to me, that's completely fine. Make sure to check it out. Other than that, strap yourself in because this is going to be a wild ride, and let's get right into it. In this video, I'm going to be talking about three most important categories in my opinion. We're going to start with the combat and how the introduction of enemy types and different weapon types combined with the spaces they fight in really contributes to something they call combat chess. Then we're going to talk about speed and how the movement of the player at always top speed within a very specific level design helps make the game more fun, which will finally lead us to the final point of simplicity, where I'll talk about how cutting mechanics has really led to player being able to understand what they're meant to do faster and enjoys themselves that way. But in the meantime, let's start right from the top with combat, and by extension, something called combat chess. Now the ID creative director Hugo Martin described the idea as the speed of movement, individuality of demons, distinctiveness of weapons, overall power of the player, and the idea of make me think, make me move. Now this leads us to the very basic and bottom idea of why do we play video games? Well, we play video games because we like to think. Every new encounter or any issue that you come up against in a game is a challenge that you need to think about and think through. This is perfectly capped in the quote as him describing the distinctiveness of weapons and individuality of the demons. At any given point in the game, you can run up against different types of enemies, and in your arsenal will be different types of equipment. It is up to you, to the player, to decide which enemy encounter you will deal with in which way. But it might not be as easy to implement as you might originally think, because when it comes to empowering the player, you need to very much think about how the AI will behave. And for a solid chunk of the development, as they describe it, they had AI that would simply rush the player and run towards them. Now on one hand, that perfectly encapsulates what a demon would do, right? They would rush the player and they would try to close the distance. However, when making games, you need to think about the gameplay and how the player will react to this. And they reported that after having playtesters try this setting and try this AI model on, they would often find themselves backing up rather than pushing forward. And the whole mentality of the Doom games is the push forward gameplay. You should be the aggressive one, you should be the one forcing the demons to retreat and eventually killing them. And that is why it has led them to rework the AI quite significantly. Rather than having them immediately charge you, they now hold their ground a lot more, giving you the option to address one of them and then move on to the next enemy, choosing your approach to every encounter kind of differently. This also has an interesting implication with the psyche of the player, because while it seems that you're going up against this huge horde of enemies, if you actually pay close attention to how the levels are divided by structures, you are only really going up against a few of them at a time, maybe a dozen at max. Once again, this is done to further enforce the idea that you are the one who's pushing them. Yes, you are one human against this army of demons, but in the combat situation, they want you to feel that you can have the advantage if you play your cards right. Having the player be empowered like this directly leads me into the next category that I want to talk about, which is the speed. And if you notice, the player in Doom will constantly move at top speed. Now this is something that has kind of been a staple of the series except for Doom 3. And guess what? Doom 3 is often seen as kind of the black sheep of the franchise, at least by people I've talked to online. It is obvious that the team behind this Doom, or the latest iteration, because that's the one I'm mostly focusing on, really wanted to recapture the feeling that the original Doom had and how they could achieve that. From the words of the developer himself, they changed the speed numerous times, into the point where they could actually make it feel good. Now, it was difficult to get the balance right, so they did something very smart. They created themselves a sort of speed test level. Now in video game making, you would often do something called a game gym, right? This is a place where you build all kinds of different obstacles that the level itself will never be present in the final game, but they present you with samples of all possible obstacles your player might encounter in the final game, and in that level makes it super easy to just tweak values, run through it, see how it feels, and tweak them again. Now once they did a specific level oriented just for speed, they were able to really get into the point where it felt good, and they were able to take that into the final release of the game. Another smart thing which you might want to pay attention to in the game is the level design, because the way it's designed often makes the player feel like they're actually moving faster than they really are on the drawing board. Having lots of divides and lots of cover in the level allows you to strafe in between, rather than just having a long distance chunk that would have you, run for a couple seconds constantly without changing direction, making you realize that you're not actually moving that fast. The movements are fast, twitchy, and responsive, which further, if you remember, cooperates with what I said in the beginning, how they want the player to be the one pushing. They want you to be the assailant. They don't want you slowly backing off into the corner. They want you to take the fight to the demons. But in a world that is so extensive and so complicated, having various weapons, having various enemy types, having kind of complex and interesting level design, it was so easy to overcomplicate it and take away from what actually makes Doom entertaining. Which is why many first-person shooters nowadays do this mistake and end up actually taking away from the experience. The way the developers of Doom describe it is they wanted to start with the fun. They wanted to start with what makes the game enjoyable. And what you will often find out is, especially in an experience like this, which is slightly more arcade-like in the sense of get in, play, cause mayhem, and get out, having the players be introduced to complicated schematics and mechanics is often not the best way to lead towards fun. In the words of the developer himself, quote, "We really feel like if the audience can't understand a complicated idea really fast, I mean in seconds, then it just doesn't belong in the game." And I think this encapsulates the reason why you don't see a really strong story in the game, or why you don't see many dialogues in the game. It's just because for the type of experience that they're really aiming for, the dynamics of which encourage you to get in and have fun at really any point, adding mechanics and adding layers on top of that would simply clutter the game and make it more difficult to understand and less enjoyable for the player. Funny enough, in the middle of the development, they actually at one point had a voice in your head directing you on which way you should go, because they thought, mechanically, it would help the player make their way through the levels. And it did. However, what they found out is that players did not like this aspect. They wanted to be their own masters. This is not Skyrim, this is fucking Doom, where you are the badass killer of demons and you fucking make your own path, right? In the end, they ended up scratching that feature entirely, and if you ask me, the game is much better off now than it was then. Okay, so let me quickly recap, just in case you were sleeping for the past 5 or 7 minutes or however long it was. What makes up the beauty, but at the same time simplicity, of Doom's gameplay? Well, at the start, we need to talk about combat and the combat chess, and how the player and their positioning juxtaposed to the demons and the variety of weapons and the way the player engages in combat really make for a big chunk of the experience, and how difficult it could be to balance those aspects the way they did in Doom, focusing on player aggression and the push forward gameplay. Second of all, they made sure to pay an homage to the original Dooms, with the top speed being present at all times for the player. This is another way to encourage them to take the aggressive approach into combat, as even if you get into a tight situation, it still allows you to quickly jolt out, get some health back in, and rush in. To add even more player immersion, this is combined with a very smart level design, which makes the player feel like they're moving faster and they're engaging the giant horde of zombies, whereas in reality, they're only fighting about 6 to 12 of them at any given point in a relatively small type of arena. But this is exactly what they were aiming for. They were going for the player experience and what it makes you feel like. And finally, the game is simple, sticking with the arcade-like push forward, jump in, jump out type of style. Not having a complex story really makes this experience much simpler and much more easier to enjoy. In the end, this just goes to show how development is done after all. You try something out, you realize it doesn't work, you scrap it and you try something else again. In the words of the developers again, quote, "There are those moments where you implement something and you implement it well and make it exactly like you want, but when you play it, you're like, that just isn't us. This isn't our game." Those are all good learnings. And that is all from me in this video. I hope you can now look at Doom and appreciate the simplicity and the amount of thought that went to it, maybe just a bit more, so that next time when you fire up Steam and you click on that beautiful play button and you hop in and you go and kill some demons, maybe you can start spotting some of the things I talked about in the video and give some appreciation for the developers, because they really did a good job. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, make sure to check back in for more, and I'll make sure to do more. I wish you all a beautiful rest off today, and I'm gonna see you all in whatever next video I make. Bye bye.